Uh, Welcome in. I'm going to first start off with an introduction. We are here to learn about strengthened industrial networks in the SOC, specifically with Splunk and Cybervision. I'm going to be presenting on behalf of Cisco. So I'm the solution manager for industrial security. I take care of our Cisco Validate designs for securing critical infrastructure. And I'm joined with my colleague, Chris Duffy. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, so Chris Duffy, I'm a senior technical content manager at Splunk, focused around a lot of cases like OT security, have a background there as well from a customer perspective as well.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so the agenda is going to be split into halves. I'm going to get us started here. We're just talking about the importance of unifying visibility across the entire attack chain. So while we're talking about OT networks and securing OT networks, what is the reason why we need to unify both the IT and the OT and not just leave that OT in a silo? And then what is the detail of how we give that SOC the visibility into the industrial networks? I'm then going to pass it over to Chris, and he's going to talk about reducing alert fatigue using risk-based alerting for OT and a feature of Splunk that really helps you filter out all of the noise that are generating from our security tools, because it's typically not just one tool that we have, and we have quite a lot of logs being generated by the system. And then how we use all of that data to drive compliance, which is an extremely important part of securing any network, but especially OT when we're trying to meet some certain standards. And we're going to finish off with a demonstration. So Chris will take us through Splunk, what it looks like, and get the look and feel, so you're not just staring at PowerPoint for an hour. So let's get started. And where I wanted to get started was just understanding the OT threat landscape. Take a look at some numbers, take a look at what are we dealing with, what do we mean by OT security. And there's a couple of reports that I really look forward to every year. One of them is from Waterfall. They have an OT cybersecurity threat report. And this one focuses on attacks that cause physical consequences, so some sort of damage that was involved in OT networks. And one of the things that we saw was quite a significant increase in the number of successful attacks that caused physical consequences. And we're getting at least one cyber attack every week. That's probably under exaggerating it. I think there was 76 or 78 successful attacks last year. So pretty closer to 1.5 attacks that were successful in OT networks, because attacks happen all of the time. There's attempts that happen all of the time. 2023 saw one attack every 13 seconds across critical infrastructure, but it gets scary when it becomes successful. And nation state attacks have tripled. And yeah, as I said, from 2023 to 2024, 146% increase in that number of attacks. So it's becoming more and more prevalent, and every single year that we do these presentations, these stats are going to keep getting worse unless we do something about them. And just to show kind of how easy it is, and you know, we talk about OT security, and there's some kind of hypotheticals that we'll talk about when we talk about attacking OT. But sometimes it's as easy as someone has connected something to the internet. And I wanted to show an example of that because there may be many of you on this call that, you know, we say, you know, poor networking practices or things connected to the internet, and you'd be like, there's no way we have OT devices connected to the internet. But in late 2023, there was a CISA advisory for these Unitronics PLCs. They used in water and wastewater systems, and there was a attack in one of the water authorities in the US. And because of that attack and because of the investigation behind that, CISA put out an advisory to say anyone else using these Unitronics PLCs and these essentially these HMIs, here's some advisory of how to protect yourselves because they're being targeted in an attack because they were made in Israel. So for those who were attacked, this was the screen that they woke up to the next time they visited their workplace. This is 2023. We're in 2025 now, and I created these slides not that long ago. And there's an internet website called Shodan. And Shodan is a search engine for what they call the Internet of Things, or Internet of Everything. Essentially, anything that is connected to the internet can be found, and this is the search engine for it. And you can do very simple searches. You can do some complex searches. There is some dedicated pages for finding SCADA systems connected to the internet if you're interested in browsing it. But if you do just a very simple search for Unitronics, you'll get over 600 results. I don't know if it's exactly 625 by the time you do it, but it'll be over 600 results probably. And just because I have some Italian colleagues, I decided to mess with them a little bit and pick on their country. And there was a water utility in Italy that I can go and log on to this HMI remotely without any authentication because it's connected to the internet. And the question we really have to ask ourselves is this happening in our network? You're going to see a Slido poll pop up on your screens, and I encourage you to answer that. Gives us the feedback into where you are in your journey. But for most of us, we don't know if this is happening. We don't know what's connected. We don't know what it's doing. We don't know what it's reaching out to, and we're inheriting these very insecure OT systems. And that's really what today's agenda is about. It's about taking our industrial threat defense approach, for anyone who's maybe seen me present before, where Cisco can provide an end-to-end security architecture or solution that kind of takes you through a journey of securing a network. We start from visibility, we move into zero trust, and then we get into that cross-domain detection and response. But we're really focusing on the two ends of this journey. The first is, how do we gain visibility in the first place with a product that we have called CyberVision? And then how do we take that visibility and how do we feed the Security Operations Center so they have all of the data that they need and the context that they need to view attacks across the entire attack chain. Because while I did show an example of OT security being relatively easy, and there are thousands of devices connected to the internet today that would directly impact our OT systems, of that same waterfall report that I just showed, only 13% of those attacks were due to direct OT attacks. For most of them, it was indirect through IT systems. So just because an attack happens on the IT or happens outside of what you would call your traditional OT perimeter doesn't mean it doesn't cause physical consequences to the OT. And it's still something we have to look at. And it took about 16 hours on average between the initial access and then the encryption of data, meaning half of the attacks that were successful last year were less than 16 hours. So it's really important that we know as quickly as possible that something is happening. And if we wait for the OT to be impacted, it's probably too late. And there was probably lots of indicators beforehand that if we were to be alerted to them quicker, we would have been able to stop it and prevent it. So I said the word attack chain a couple of times. This is, for those of you who maybe have not heard of this before, but a typical attack outside of that example where I would have basically had an OT device directly connected to the internet. How typically would we get into the OT? Well, the first thing we do is probably create a phishing campaign. I try to get someone on this call to click a link or scan a QR code or do something that redirects you to my website. On that website, it's going to download some malware to your machine. And this all happens very quickly in today's day and age. Like the internet speeds are so quick that I can bring you to a malicious website, download a small payload, and then redirect you to a legitimate website, probably before you even realize. You probably just thought there was some glitch in the browser loading. And then the next time you visit the OT facility or you log in remotely, there's going to be some unusual activity that I start to generate from your computer, hopefully do some discovery, some lateral movement, or maybe just directly access the OT. But there was a path for me to get there. And the great thing about security is we have solutions to secure all of it. So, I'm obviously going to use Cisco logos here, but there's plenty of logos for these capabilities throughout the industry. But you will have email security. You will be using your DNS security. You'll have endpoint security on your managed endpoints. You'll be hopefully using some secure remote access solution like what we have with secure equipment access. And then CyberVision, what I'm going to talk about today, will tell you if there's unusual activity happening in your OT network. But they all operate in silos. For you to understand what is truly happening, you would have to log into each one of these screens individually, look at the logs, find the common data points, and then do that stitching together manually. And this is where that kind of Splunk part really comes in, is it takes all of the guesswork for you, and it just presents it to you in the way that you can get to it quickly. And we ran this State of Industrial Networking report sometime last year, where we wanted to understand, what the priorities were of industry. And this was a very common response across every respondent across every industry. This wasn't just manufacturing or utilities, it was a range of multiple critical industries. And 87% of respondents agreed that in the next 2 years, there's going to be significant value in unifying the solution across enterprise and industrial networks. And within the C-suite, that raises to 92%. What we're looking for is a unified solution between IT and OT, because we only really want one SOC. And attacks don't discriminate between IT and OT. The solution also needs to provide the same. So when we talk about visibility in OT networks, the biggest challenge we really have is how do you get access to the data? We see the same challenge happening in the world of AI, where there's a lot of solutions out there, there's a lot of capabilities out there. If you give them access to your data, we always overlook that key part is if we get access to your data, because there's plenty of vendors that can do OT visibility if they have access to your data. Because the way we do it is through deep packet inspection of OT protocols. So we need to be able to passively inspect all of the traffic through your OT network, whether that's in a remote substation, whether that's deep within your manufacturer networks. We need to see the data. And the way most people will try to do it is they'll tell you, span your data to me, and I'll tell you what it's doing. This is very difficult to implement because there's a lot of assets in the OT network and a lot of unmanaged switching that maybe doesn't support it, or even if you do have the managed switching, a lot of cabling that needs to go into it, the cables are very expensive. Then you need to build the out-of-band hardware sensors, and that kind of deviates away from what we're trying to do in the operations side, which is virtualize everything and get rid of hardware. So we don't want to put more hardware in there, more cabling, more power, more complexity, just to get access to this data. So most projects stall at the distribution layer. We get as far as we can, we realize we can't get any further, and we just accept the fact that we have limited visibility again. And we ran into this same issue across multiple customers. This is the one I like highlighting the best. CPFL is a utility in Brazil. And it's a huge footprint, multiple transmission substations, but over 670 distribution substations. And the issue that they had was some of it is connected by low bandwidth satellite, and others are connected over cellular. So you're basically paying for data that leaves the facility. So they can't span, they can't take any data off those networks. They would just, you don't want to pay for it, you don't have the bandwidth to do it. So CyberVision was the only one who could do it embedded into the network. So as we're going to learn in the next slide, that the real differentiation with Cisco CyberVision for OT visibility, it's embedded into our hardware. You need a switch for connectivity, you need a router for connectivity. Those two things are going to exist. Maybe it's a standalone router, maybe it's a router and a switch, but you need network connectivity to get connectivity. What Cisco's helping you avoid is another box for visibility, and outside of the scope of this, but another box for remote access, another box for segmentation, and all of these security capabilities that typically you might get a point solution for. The visibility is just built in. So we were able to put CyberVision sensors distributed out into this remote environment, do deep packet inspection locally within the routing and the switching, and then we'll only send metadata back. So it didn't matter that it was low bandwidth satellite, we weren't really consuming much bandwidth, and it didn't matter it was cellular because you weren't really paying for much data. And the quote from CPFL, Cisco were the only ones able to do this for them and do it at scale. Because there was another vendor in here before we came in and had to replace them, because we were the only ones that can do it. So while some solutions work great in a lab environment, when you have full control over everything, doing this at scale becomes a very difficult challenge. And this is the solution that I mentioned. So Cisco CyberVision is the name. You're probably going to hear me say it in every slide that you see. But it's a two-tier architecture. There's a CyberVision Center, which is a virtual machine or a physical appliance. It's really up to you how you want to consume it. And then all of the magic happens in the CyberVision sensors. And those things exist on our switches, on our routers. And it's not just the ruggedized switches as well. It exists on the Catalyst. So if you have Catalyst 93s, 94s in your environment, you can also run CyberVision sensors. And what they're doing is they're just doing passive deep packet inspection of all of the traffic that's already running through. So you don't need to do anything more other than just give a copy of what's going through the switch into the application itself, and we'll do the deep packet inspection locally. We only send about, we put 5% on the top end. Normally it's about 3% of additional traffic on the network. And if you need to, we'll do active discovery from the sensors itself. So we're not doing active discovery from the center. So again, go back to that utility use case. If you weren't getting enough information passively, because maybe you just weren't seeing the right data, the data wasn't generating enough rich information, we can do active discovery, which then allows us to go and essentially probe the devices. using the native protocols, and that happens from the switch or from the router itself. So we're doing everything locally to the OT, and we've no impact on that network performance because we're completely out of band. Now, we don't want to put anyone off by saying you need to put us in a Cisco infrastructure. That is the best way of doing it. It's the most efficient way of doing it. But we do have other deployment options. So one of maybe a potential complaint is we don't have a Cisco network. But that's okay. We'll give you a Docker sensor and you can host it wherever you want to host it. We can give you a hardware sensor if you just want a dedicated hardware sensor. We just try to avoid those because they typically don't scale as well as an embedded sensor solution, but of course we can support it. And we can also span directly to the center itself. So there is another Slido poll on your screens, and we're interested in how you're doing network discovery today, if you do have an automated way or not. But CyberVision itself is flexible to any environment really, and the kind of the latest sensor release, as we mentioned, is that Dockerized sensor. So for those of you who maybe have history of CyberVision before, this wasn't something you might have heard a year ago, but it's something that's available now, completely decoupled from the hardware. And then I just want to kind of show you some screens that what you would get with CyberVision. So what do we mean by deep packet inspection? What do we mean by OT visibility? How is it any different to IT visibility if some of you on this call are new to the OT world? The difference is to do OT visibility, you really need to understand the payloads and the traffic that happens within OT devices. It's not simple kind of net flow where you have IP addresses and open ports. It's actually understanding the payload properties and doing deep packet inspection of OT protocols. So the Modbus, Ethernet IP, Siemens S7, OPC UA, things like that. And what we get is a detailed profile of what devices are. So for example, in this case, it's very small, so sorry about that, but there is a device that is a Rockwell automation controller, and you can see in red, stop CPU. We're able to see the Ethernet IP command that someone tried to stop the CPU, or we see resets, we see reads and writes and program downloads, the details of what's actually happening in between them. And as part of those transactions that happen in an OT network on a daily basis, if someone opens up one of those vendor tools like a TIA portal for Siemens or an RS Logix or Rockwell, we will see the interaction between those devices and be able to pull things like the firmware versions and the model numbers and basically the device properties that lets us know in detail what is this device. And when we get that detail of what's in that device, we can then tell you the risk that device has in the network. Because based on those properties, you've got vulnerabilities. It'll be, well, this firmware version is 31 and everything below version 33 has these vulnerabilities because you haven't patched it. And the more severe the vulnerabilities are, and the more severe some of the communications are, the risk score is either going to increase or decrease. Because when you have a system, you've got 6, 7, 10, 15,000 devices that we've discovered, you need a starting point. You can't just start taking remediation action straight away on thousands of devices, and that's where the risk score comes. The risk score is essentially saying, how risky is this device to my network? And there is some customization to that. If you define a certain group of devices more important than others, we'll take that into account and we'll generate that risk score for you. But these are the type of things that CyberVision is going to generate, and then Splunk can then leverage within its tool as well. The other part of visibility that we do have is Snort. So Snort is something that maybe some of you are familiar with, especially for those of you who are familiar with Cisco. It is our IDS IPS engine that we use across all Cisco products that support it. And in CyberVision, it's very much an IDS. We're out of band, we're not in line. We just have a copy of your traffic. We can never become an IPS. We integrate with segmentation tools for that. But the IDS engine is there. So for the same engine that you're familiar with in Firewall, Meraki, and Secure Access, and other places we have it, that same engine can be deployed within the network to give you the IDS signatures, including custom signatures if you want to upload those too, for those of you who are familiar enough with the platform. And then communications is probably the last thing I'm going to talk about purely from a CyberVision perspective, but just understanding what those devices are doing. Which one of my devices are communicating the internet? I don't know how many times we've had conversations where someone says we are an air-gapped network, and suddenly we have to go back and ask them what their definition of air-gap is because we see devices communicating to the internet. And they say, well, we didn't mean those devices, we meant this other device. And That's not air-gapped. There's always paths from the internet in, and CyberVision is the type of tool that will show you that these paths exist, because that workstation isn't air-gapped, and that workstation speaks to the PLC, so therefore your PLC is not air-gapped. But definitions vary depending on customers, but it's how do you know what's happening in your network? Well, you need visibility to understand truly what's happening on your network. And while visibility is great, and visibility is the scope of this presentation, I do want to just kind of point out that we do leverage all of this for segmentation. So when I showed you industrial threat defense, there is more to the journey than just visibility. We're going to skip this big chunk of the security journey, which is all about kind of zero trust segmentation. How do we build out the IEC 64/3 zones and conduits model and turns visibility into segmentation? Maybe that's a topic for another webinar, and I'm sure there's recordings that out there where you'll hear me talk about it if you want to see my face again. I'm going to pass you over to Chris because I want him to show you how all of this data from CyberVision integrates into the larger SOC ecosystem. So, Chris, over to you. You're muted. All right.
Sorry about that. I think it has to happen on every call. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how using the Cisco technologies, particularly CyberVision with Splunk, kind of how those things come together and why it's important. So Splunk, a big part of what Splunk does is bringing together data so you can correlate across different data sources, across different environments and things like that. Sometimes that's more for network performance or maybe application infrastructure monitoring. Obviously, we're here to talk about security. And so CyberVision is one of those key sources, and I'll kind of, as part of this, I'll cover where specifically we require CyberVision for visibility. And so the first thing I want to talk about is about this journey of potentially doing something like a converged SOC. Might be an OT SOC. It doesn't really matter either. Splunk can accommodate either. But in this case, where we're talking about visibility across both, alert fatigue becomes a big concern. Now, this is some of the reasons that it becomes a big concern. So especially if you're building like an integrated IT OT SOC, they're already dealing with problems around like alert fatigue. So lots and lots of volumes of different alerts from different platforms, from different correlations and detections. And so what risk-based alerting is designed primarily around a few key cases. One is to reduce that alert volume. So, and I'll explain exactly how it does that, but reducing, so you don't have teams that are overwhelmed, they're not getting tons of alerts. The second part, besides just reducing the alert volume, is really around making your alerts high fidelity or more actionable. So instead of having to chase a bunch of things that maybe you can or cannot act on them, or you're not really sure how they might fit into a bigger picture, risk-based alerting is one of the ways to get better fidelity. Because typically, from the studies that I've done, we have 40% organizations, they receive over 10,000 alerts per day. You can imagine that if you're working in that SOC, that's going to overwhelm you, even if you have a large team, right? It's just too many to respond to. Over 50% of those are typically false positives. So it's going to change your behavior. So you might, for instance, just ignore alerts entirely, or you might say, hey, this alert it just does not provide enough information. It's just, there's not enough there for me to do anything about it. So I'm just going to abandon it. And then you might also have things where you just ignore alerts or you suppress them. Like, hey, I always get this. There's nothing I know it's probably a false positive. It's not a high priority. I'm just going to kind of push it to the side and suppress it. You can also imagine that for the ones that are credible, the things you do need to investigate, you're going to have slow response and detection, right? Because you've got so many, it's going to be hard for your SOC analysts to know which ones to focus and filter through the noise. That oftentimes leads to analyst burnout. If you've got, if you're responding to all these alerts, right, it gets overwhelming, especially if you're responding to false positives and things like that, right? It kind of just really makes your job very frustrating. There's lots of jobs out there, right? And for this kind of role. And so in a lot of cases, they may not want to deal with it and they'll move on to the next opportunity. The other impact there is just you get that low confidence in your detections. Yeah, I'm getting all these detections, but none of them are valuable, or not a lot of them are valuable. Not a lot. My tools clearly are not doing their job because they're not filtering out that noise and things like that. So these are all kind of this consequence of these massive alert volumes. If you think about in the case of a lot of organizations where they are looking to build a converged SOC, they're already overwhelmed. And then now you're going to add all this OT stuff in it. And they may not know what to do with it. They may not, it's a new area of expertise for them. This is just going to get worse. So that's where our risk-based alerting comes in. So this is a built-in tool with our enterprise security. And if you think about it, a traditional alert is I see something, I create an alert, analyst has to respond, do the investigation, triage, all that stuff. Okay. So with risk-based alerting, we're not going to take out the analysis or the correlation. That's an important part. We need to have detections and things like that. The difference is we're not necessarily just going to create an alert. What we're actually going to do is we're going to take that data and we're going to assign a risk score and put it in a risk index. So we're going to say this kind of behavior, it raises the risk profile of this asset by 10 points or 20 points, or or it raises the risk profile of a particular facility or a user, right? So again, we're still not just creating an alert for them to immediately respond. We're saying, okay, this kind of activity is indicative of potential risky behavior. Now we're going to put that into a risk index, and then we're going to use that to generate an alert. Now, instead of the way you might think about this is I may have 30 different observations, detections involved here. So if I create 30 alerts, that's too much. What happens with risk-based alerting is we're going to take all that data from the risk index. We're going to take things like looking at MITRE ATT&CK, different security frameworks, risk scores, and things like that. And we're going to now create one alert for those 30 different. The great thing here is I don't lose the other 30 events that led to this. And so what it's going to allow me to do is group those things and really only respond when particularly high risky behaviors detected. So that could be in the number of alerts, the total risk score, number of TTPs, things like that. So there's different ways you can customize it. You can do it over a 24-hour period, an hour, you have the options to do whatever. And so what does that look like? So this is kind of the sequence of activities that, as you can see here, there's 7 different items here. That's going to be at least 7 different alerts. So first we start with some spear phishing attempt. Andrew kind of talked about a similar use case. So obviously this is typically on the corporate side, right? Someone's getting phished. Then we start seeing suspicious scanning of the environment, potentially from maybe the machine that they got phished on. We start seeing probing activities. Now, probing activities might be normal, right? They might be, or these scanning activities, they might be a vulnerability detection or vulnerability detection engine, things like that, right? And so, again, these are all things where, I might get an alert, but that's completely normal because this is when my scheduled scan happens. Now we start seeing activity over on the OT side. So in this case, we have a user who has a shared account. So a lot of times we see in OT environments, you might have the IT within it, the infrastructure managed by IT teams, right? And often they're going to share the same username. And so what we're now seeing is this user got phished. We're seeing some VPN activity. Again, might be normal. But then we see them now access a domain controller and create a generic vendor account. Okay, again, that might be normal. Then we see, okay, now they've gained access to an engineering workstation with that vendor account. And then we see this PLC activity, right? So we're not all kind of associated with activity from this particular user in this case. So again, a normal traditional way would, I'm creating a whole bunch of alerts. Each person like, oh, like the scanning. Okay, well, do I have a vulnerability scan that was kicked off? Is this normal? Does it then scan the OT firewalls, right? So does it do all these? A lot of investigation. What happens with risk-based alerting is instead of creating all those alerts, as you can see, we assign them a risk calculation. So we assign them a certain number of risk points you might think of. And these can be done dynamically. You could say, well, on an OT firewall scanning activity, I'm going to double the normal risk score, things like that, or diminish it because it's occurring when I normally do scans, things like that, right? And so what we do here is we assign each of these a point value, and then we set up one rule that says, in this case, hey, if I go over 100 in a 24-hour period, I'm going to create an alert. Again, I'm going to group all these things. So when I look at it in my platform, it's grouped all these things automatically for me. So I don't have to go, oh, what were some suspicious events that occurred before? They're already there for me. They're going to make that investigation easier. So again, this is a thing we do differently. We see this used with a lot of different tools who, if tools are particularly known to be really noisy, yeah, you can filter out some of that, but sometimes those indicators might be important in a particular situation. So risk-based alerting is kind of one of those techniques that you can use to really kind of reduce that alert fatigue, but also, again, trying to drive to more high fidelity alerts. So like this one, when the PLC restarts sporadically, right? That's, now I have all this activity of, oh, what was all the activity that led up to it? And so risk-based alerting is going to be a tool that will help you with that, especially as you look at, potentially integrating IT, OT SOCs, even if you just got an OT SOC, right? Being able to leverage this is going to be a valuable tool to make sure, if you've got an OT SOC, that may mean your team is like 1 or 2 people, maybe a very small team. And so again, you might have a smaller team. Even if it's a converged SOC, you may have a smaller team to be able to handle these kinds of alerts. So reducing the noise and so you don't have to call out to operators or things like that and bug them for things that they can't do anything about or are normal, that you're going to gain their trust as well. So it's important to be a useful tool in terms of gaining that trust, high fidelity alerts, and then just reducing the noise. So we're gonna switch a little bit. I wanted to cover risk-based alerting, but then we want to also cover how this looks together with Splunk around, with dashboards, reports, things like that. And so we're just going to lay the groundwork a little bit of where in particular do we, how we see Splunk fit in this picture. And Andrew touched a lot on this. So obviously traditional things like Splunk Security Suite, it's more traditionally used on the IT environment, right? The corporate environment. So we also have cyber vision. Now, cyber vision doesn't just cover this lower area. They have visibility above this, but this is a particular area where Splunk lacks visibility. So we can't tell you that PLC restarted or that it's an Allen Bradley PLC or a compact logic device. We can't tell you that because we just don't have the knowledge that cyber vision does in terms of the protocols and the device information, things like that. That also means that they're going to have detections of vulnerabilities that might not be detected with another product, but also a lot of times in OT environments, you can't use vulnerability scanners. So because they're doing it passively, we're going to get that vulnerability information. And where Splunk really fits into this is bringing it all together. So it's going to be our traditional security suite, but we're going to add this OT security add-on. I'll talk about what's included with that. So that's a free add-on that goes on top of the security suite. But then part of that is we're making sure the cyber vision data is going in there. That way we have that visibility all across either the whole environment or a whole organization or, level 3.5 down to the lower levels, right? Because as Andrew mentioned, they don't always have to get over, when they enter an environment, they're typically targeting things that, they already know how to access: servers, workstations, things that are connected to the internet, right? They don't often just start with the PLC. They're going to come in on that Windows XP workstation, that Server 2003, and they'll either do it coming from the corporate environment, or you might have something exposed to the internet. So what we feel like is if you really want to protect your OT environment, you can't just focus on one end. You have to cover the whole thing. You have to know how they got there. Ideally, you stop them from getting any farther, but you need to know if something does happen, if something's detected in cyber vision, oh, well, exactly how did they breach my system? Did they come over from the corporate? Did I have something exposed that I shouldn't be, right? You need to be able to understand that whole chain to be able to prevent it in the future. And ideally, you catch it before it gets to that point. Splunk can help you do both, but it's important to have that complete visibility. So I mentioned the OT security add-on for enterprise security. So enterprise security is our SIEM product, okay? So there's a couple things that get added on top of our traditional scene here. So one is a number of these unified data models. So the way I respond to an OT incident very much depends on the context. So if this is a SCADA server and it's running the production system, right? Well, I can't take certain actions because it's running the system. Or if this is an engineering workstation or a PLC, my response is going to be dramatically different, sometimes even between one facility or the other. And so these unified data models allow us to basically, here's some important contextual information, here's some information that's technology agnostic. So if you use one endpoint protection product or multiple, on the Splunk side, these data models essentially make it transparent for you. So it doesn't matter which product you're using. There is a number of items in here that are really designed to help you get started faster. These are things like perimeter monitoring your endpoint protection, USB usage. There's dashboards and content that are already built there to do that. And so allowing you to do, a lot of them take a trust but verify. So, my team says I should never have anything connecting out to the internet. Well, when I actually look at the traffic, is that true? And so you can use Splunk to be able to set up these use cases, and it will tell you, give you dashboards, reports, alerts, and things like that. Will tell you, hey, here's something, hey, you say should not be there, but actually is there. Enterprise security already has a lot of common security frameworks like traditional MITRE ATT&CK, kill chain, CIS-18. With this particular module, we also add MITRE ATT&CK for ICS in particular, which is in kind of OT flavor version of MITRE ATT&CK. We also allow you to do things like helping mitigate risk and identifying problems. So typically what this involves is, okay, I can't install a security tool, or I can't do something, I can't change something. My vendor says I can't do that. It's got to be this way. So what this allows you to do is look at things like your assets and how they're configured. So what applications should be installed on these hosts? How should services be configured? And what you can actually do is you can build this in Splunk, and then you can say, oh, I've all these machines should have the same kind of, let's just say, applications installed. Well, when I look at it, I actually see, well, one, here's some products that are not installed, or maybe here's some that are missing. And so it allows you to kind of do those kind of asset-based lining capabilities, both for, traditional kind of servers, workstations, but you can also do some capabilities as well around networks and things like that. So, again, just as a method to mitigate risk where I can't do certain things, so I'll do this instead. And then it does come with a bunch of pre-built detections and use cases already built into it. There's already a lot of capabilities in enterprise security that apply to an OT environment. Like you might see brute force in either environment, right? And so what the use case explorer allows you to do is it says, okay, you want to monitor remote access. Well, here's some existing detections that you could leverage, and here's some additional ones that we've added as part of the app. We also have what's called enterprise security content updates. Those are, a new threat comes out. Like for example, I'll just use Log4j. I know it's a few years old. So like literally within a day, we have detections out there for it in your environment. And so the enterprise security content updates is kind of more for the like, hey, here's new stuff that's been detected. Here's detections and things like that you can leverage. And so I know we didn't want to kill your slideware, so I'm going to jump into a demo to kind of show you what this looks like. And I'll give you a little bit of background. So I'm here within Splunk's enterprise security, and I'm specifically in the queue where like a SOC person would be. Now, just understand, again, as I mentioned, there's a whole lot of other content that gets included. We won't have time to show all of that. If you have things like NERC-CIP, for instance, we have specific dashboards that you can use for auditing and things like that against NERC-CIP that are tied, as you can see, to specific parts of the regulation in terms of compliance. But what we're going to do in this story is we're going to kind of step through some of the ways that you could leverage Splunk like an investigation. So in this case, a user on the corporate domain has been phished and ransomware's been deployed. And we're going to assume that someone is taking care of that. So the team that's responsible for that, they're quarantined. They're doing whatever they need to do it. Um, they've gotten detection, so they've seen, hey, I saw something execute from a PDF, and now I see the CLOP ransomware. And any of these I can drill down. So if I wanted to see more information about them, I could. But in this case, we've grouped them into an investigation. And so if I click show me the details of this investigation, it's going to merge all that. So we're going to see those two events. We're going to see things like, oh, this is related to this machine. Here's the IP of that machine. Here's MAC addresses. All that kind of information that we have will be here. And I can also do things as I investigate. I can add notes. I can obviously assign it to people and things like that. I can attach additional evidence and things like that. In this case, what we have been asked to do is we're going to assume that's being taken care of. And what they've asked us to do is basically determine, is there any other suspicious activity going on in the OT environment? And we're going to focus on this user because it was a user that was phished. And we know sometimes, in this case, the user's Stan. And we've been asked to basically see, hey, do we see anything else suspicious? We happen to know that Stan has an account both on the IT and the OT domains because he basically supports both to some level. And so what I can do is I can take this user, and what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to look for any activity by that user on the OT environment. And so I've kind of pre-opened this, but this is where it would take us. Now, what Splunk has done is it's actually detected that there's a secondary user involved with Stan's activities named Bender, okay? And so what I can start doing is I can start with Stan. So I go here, I see, if I look under domain, I'll zoom this up actually a little bit, make it a little bit easier. Under the domain, we see that, yes, he has a corporate account. He also has an account on the ops.local, which is our OT domain. And if we just kind of follow that trail on the ops.local, we see he's had some logins. We also see that there's some activity related to user accounts being changed. And if we go into the details, we see that there's a new user account created. That's probably that vendor account that's related, right? And then we also see that he's made changes in terms of security groups under the details. And then if I scroll to the right, I see, if I look under the sources and destinations, I'm going to see several of those involved. So one, there is a PLC somewhere, however, involved. We'll look and find out where that is. Here's that corporate machine. But then we also see that if I look at the different machines, he's got this domain control, this GCC AD01. We see there's also some activity from the source on this JS01. That's one of our jump servers. And then we also see activity related to this engineering workstation. So what we want to do is we want to pivot. So we want to see, okay, we see this user, he's gotten in, he's created an account. What other activity do we see on the hosts? And so, for instance, we can come down to the bottom section. Here's the domain controller. Makes sense. That's where the changes happened on the environment, creating accounts and things like that. We see we can go to that jump server and we can see, okay, well, that's how he accessed the domain controller. There's a line there. But then we also see he's accessed that engineering workstation, that GCC ENG01. We see he's logged in into that machine. And so if you just took Splunk, most of this would be able to be detected by looking at different kinds of solutions you have in the environment. So we'd be able to see, yes, he's come in, he's modified the domain, he's created these accounts, he's accessed these machines. What we don't have is the so what. We don't have like, okay, well, what did he do in the end? So what we want to do is, because we know he accessed this ENG01 from that jump server, we're going to pivot to that. And this is where we start seeing and getting the value of cyber vision, because now we see not only did he access that engineering workstation, but that created some activity related to this mil POC 40. And specifically, we see there's been a program upload, there's been stop commands, there's been a reset process command, all thanks because we have that visibility. So cyber vision, for those cases where the end goal is the industrial equipment, the production line, the substation, whatever, it's going to give us that key visibility. It's going to tell us, so what? We can similarly see this if I go down below. So like if I had activity from suspicious activities, but Splunk's actually put this all together for me. So it's saying, this account was logged in all the way until we get, again, to that PLC, and we see repeatedly there's been these stop CPU commands sent, right? That's probably what's affecting our production line, right? And we can see now the whole chain of, in terms of how did this person move laterally, using this shared account. The other thing that we could do is, this is all more or less after the fact. We can also be proactive. One of the ways we'd do that would be something with our perimeter monitoring. And so what we're doing in this case is, again, this is a trust but verify mechanism. And so what we're looking for is things we have identified that are inbound, they're being allowed. In this case, we're looking at specifically for FTP that's inbound. And then we're looking at it to that jump server, because we knew it looked like the jump server was the infiltration point. So we want to see, well, is there other suspicious things going on? And so what we see here, here's that host. And here we see all the FTP data flowing in. And in some cases, like in this case, it's just going through a single firewall. So if I want to block this, it's pretty easy either to go to the firewall, or I can go back to the individual hosts. If I look lower, I see all these machines, again, communicating through this firewall. So if this is something that shouldn't be there, I'm going to be proactive, and I can just come right here to the firewall. So I can say, hey, I'm going to review my firewall rules. Maybe something's out of place. Maybe I didn't account for something. Something's misconfigured. But by coming to the firewall, I can just block all that. So if this is something that shouldn't be there, I can just block at the firewall. But I also have the option of like, well, maybe I want to go investigate what's happening on these machines. Maybe there's something misconfigured or turned on. Maybe there's malware on them, right? And so this kind of just gives you that ability to start being proactive in terms of, this is what you say, and this is what's actually there. And of course, all this can then be summarized. So like that's me more or less the result of, drilling down, but I can also do it down here where I can just get a list of what's allowed, what's prohibited, but is actually being allowed. So like, here's traffic coming from a system outside my company. I don't care whether it's FTP or Telnet, it shouldn't be there, right? And so Splunk can be a valuable tool to start helping you be more proactive, like, oh, here's a security vulnerability that I say shouldn't be there, but actually is. And so that's how you kind of bring those two together. Some of those detections can also come from cyber vision as well. Like we saw Andrew talking about the external traffic, those can come from that as well. But again, that cyber vision piece especially is a key part of the visibility that is just not native to Splunk. So let me jump back over real quick. So that's the end of kind of our presentation. We want to highlight a few key takeaways. So the first is, we launch our last Slido poll as well. If you really want to protect OT, there's no one technology that does it. We learned this long ago in IT, right? There's new threats, there's new ways, things that need to be monitored and detected. Same thing is true in OT. You're not going to have one tool, one technology that's going to solve it all, because in order to adequately protect it, it's a lot of different security domains and expertise you need. We saw this very early on when OT security started becoming a hot topic. We saw organizations who just went out and they just bought one technology and they thought they would be good. And what they've now discovered is no, it's multiple tools and technologies, and they really need to be brought together. You can't view them in silos because sometimes things cross multiple domains. Second thing is, as you look to integrate some of these things into workflows and SOCs and things like that, just sending it all over to IT, an IT SOC is not going to work very well, nor is just turning everything on for an OT SOC. So looking at different ways to address alerting are important. And I'll just give you real quick a practical example. Had a several of our customers who, when they turned on monitoring for things like brute force on their OT environment, they looked like a ton of it. And what they actually found out in many of those cases was this was more a failure in process. So someone would RDP into a host, they would do whatever work, and instead of logging out, they disconnected, and then they later had to change their password, right? And so it keeps hitting the machine. And so if you just approach this of turning it on traditional methods, chances are you're going to overwhelm teams and both on both sides. So those who are being asked to respond from the OT side, as well as those who have to respond like in a SOC. So look for ways to make your learning essentially more effective. And risk-based learning's one example of that. And then the last takeaway is you need a tool that's flexible. OT environments are composed of IT components in terms of IT infrastructure and things like that, as well as OT devices and things like that, right? So you need to really understand, ideally you have a tool that is flexible enough for both, that can handle both, especially for cases like the IT/OT SOC, right? We want a tool, we don't want to have two different tools to manage two different environments, right? So having a tool that's flexible where you can unify that can be really valuable in terms of like how you have to train people, how they respond, and things like that. So these are just kind of a couple key takeaways in terms of just you need visibility and you need to approach this in an organized, methodic manner, and you need the right tools to help you. So if you want to learn more, we've got a QR code there as well, where you can go learn more about OT and IoT security as with both Splunk and Cisco. So let me ask Anas. I don't know that's really the end of our presentation, but I didn't know if there were any questions people wanted to ask, or a couple that you felt from the Q&A that might be better to answer live.
Yeah, Chris, I think there's two. One about asset lookup in Pacific. Is there, automated way of doing this? Because obviously manual process is not something that, people are keen on. And then
Yeah.
second question would be around documentation, how to integrate Cisco Cybervision along with OT security add-on.
Okay. So yeah, excellent question. So I'll take the first. So the way Splunk works in terms of like asset ability. So one, we can ingest from dynamic sources. So like CyberVision, we can ingest the asset information from CyberVision. The integration already maps it to the appropriate fields in Splunk. If you have other ways, so data coming from, say, a domain controller or patching solutions like WSUS, we can leverage those as well. Now, all of them is going to provide a little bit different information, a different level of detail. But there are ways to essentially take the information they have. Don't think you have to like then put it into like a CMDB or like a master. Splunk can take all of those, and then in essence, it will merge it into a master inventory. For those, and that's really the ideal situation. The reality is a lot of our customers really are a hybrid. So they also still have spreadsheets with asset information and things like that. We can handle all of that. So if you're, hey, I'm going to upload this spreadsheet and I'm going to take information from my domain or CyberVision, and I want to place those as like a higher fidelity, Splunk can handle all those. And so we really can handle a variety of different either integrations with tools that you have, CMDBs, ServiceNow, things like that, right? But we can also be flexible enough to, you know what, all I've got is a spreadsheet that this person, tries to keep up to date. We know that's not great because it's easy for things to slip through the cracks. But the reality is a lot of our customers have to do that hybrid approach. And so we can support the both of them together or separately, obviously. And then the other thing that you asked about was documentation. So there is various documentation that we can share kind of as a follow-up in terms of like how these things come together. We have lab environments as well where we can kind of show, yeah, here's the CyberVision data and here's how it's integrated. We also have workshops as well that kind of walk through integrating some of those tools together. So there's lots of different ways as well as the documentation which can be shared that talk about, oh, here's like in the case of CyberVision, there's an add-on that you install and then you just configure to collect the data. And so there's documentation around that, like, okay, how do you set up that app and things like that. So lots of things we can kind of provide as a follow-up. Any other in us?
No, that's about it.
Well, one came in that I can handle. So, how does Cybervision handle encrypted OT protocols? So, Cybervision doesn't decrypt the OT protocols. It'll see that they're happening. So, we'll see a relationship between two assets. We'll see the protocol is being used, and we'll tell you it's encrypted. But we don't decrypt to do payload inspection of that. So, we're limited into what we can see within the payload.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's really the abnormal situation that it's actually encrypted. Typically, it's in plain text and everything plain. All right, so we want to thank everyone for joining the webinar. I'll turn the time back over to you, Tori.
Awesome. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. We hope you found today's session informative and valuable. A special thanks goes to our presenters and panelists, and we will be reaching out to you all soon with a recording. Thanks.